Okay, second lecture for the week. Let me see. There we go. Okay. This is where we left off. Youth in school. Alcohol and drug use among adolescents has a great deal to do with crime. More than half the juvenile males arrested test positive for one or more illegal drugs. Marijuana is the most frequently found drug among these individuals. Now, this kind of is counterintuitive because marijuana is supposed to make you mellow. So, what the hell are these people doing, committing crimes when they've been smoking pot? Does it make you stupid? Well, maybe that's the answer rather than the whole mellow thing. And maybe not everybody has the same reaction to marijuana. But as you can see, marijuana is most frequently found drug among these individuals who have committed juveniles who have committed crimes. One of the major reasons people use psychoactive substances is to delay taking care of their problems. When this happens with an adolescent, they may not learn to deal with life's conflicts until they are deep into adulthood. They have prolonged the maturation process. And of course, a lot of people want to stay kids for the rest of their lives. Factors that lead an adolescent to use psychoactive substances: being subject to physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, being mentally or emotionally disturbed, lacking self esteem, peer group encouragement to use drugs, inconsistent discipline where drug use is tolerated, dropping out of school, getting caught in the juvenile justice system, getting pregnant, living in poverty, lacking alternative activities, being in a school that does not control drug problems. These are all possibilities as to why an individual uses psychoactive substances. Factors that help children avoid drugs: having a strong sense of family participation and involvement. You don't want to embarrass your or disappoint your family, your parents. Family position on drugs, alcohol, and sex that the child can adopt as their own. If they're against drugs and alcohol, then of course, if the family is against it, then it's easy for the child to say, this is not something my family does. Strong spiritual sense and community involvement, attachment to a clean and sober adult role model. And of course, that can be a coach, that can be a grandparent, that can be an aunt and uncle, that can certainly be a parent. Usually it's a parent, but it can be someone else as well. There are programs that have been developed to help school age children K through 12 stay away from drugs and alcohol. I have dealt with the DARE program before, drug abuse resistance education. It's a 16 to 17 week session conducted by uniformed police to the 5th and 6th graders. When I was overseas, I was in Japan. And of course, Japan's kind of a funny place. It's a collectivist society, so people do what they're supposed to do. But one of the things that will see in Japan is a beer dispensing uh, vending machine on every corner. So you can buy a beer. Anybody can buy a beer. A 5-year-old can buy a beer. All they need to do is have the money. Dare to Be You, the DTBY program. Family Matter is another one. Lions Quest Skills for Adolescents. Curiously enough, when I was living in California, in Northridge, California, I worked for the RAND Corporation and I did educational research for them. And one of some of the research that we did was on Lions Quest, trying to find out if it actually worked. And we went to all the junior high schools in the area and gave them the Lions Quest quiz to find out what it was that they needed, what kind of drug and alcohol interdiction did they need. And it was really kind of fascinating. Most of we only went to public schools. We didn't go to any of the private schools. And just about the entire population that we saw was Hispanic, as interesting as that is. Hardly any African Americans, hardly any non or white teenagers. Is really kind of interesting. Multisystemic therapy, MST, the New Beginnings program, Project Towards No Drug Abuse, Seeking Safety, life skills training. This increases social skills to help resist peer pressure. All the programs to help prevent drug abuse are similar. They all involve a coordinated effort among family members, teachers, and other school officials. These school based programs tend to teach life skills, resistance education, and normative education. Normative education aims at correcting erroneous beliefs about the prevalence and the acceptability of alcohol and drug use among an individual's peers. Family focused primary prevention is a necessary adjunct to any school based program. Experimentation, social use, habituation, and abuse usually begins in junior high school. So if you can, if you have ever used any drugs, alcohol, or tobacco, whatever, think when you started. Most people don't start in elementary school. It's usually in junior high school when you're thinking maybe you are an adult. Of course, you're not yet, but you still think that maybe you are. And that's the sixth grade, seventh grade, and eighth grades. Because of this proclivity, primary prevention needs to continue while secondary prevention is put in place to deal with those who didn't get the message. School personnel and families should be trained to recognize drug use and how to deal with the consequences. For those students who begin abusing drugs on a regular basis, treatment must be sought to reduce the probability of a lifetime of abuse. Such a program is the Positive Behavioral Interventions and Supports, the PBIS, adjustments to the environment to reduce the problem, building general competencies and teaching replacement skills, implementing consequences to promote positive behaviors and deter problems, crisis management or relapse plan. 1 in 4 children in the United States is exposed to alcohol abuse or dependence in their family. These children will be affected by alcohol even when they don't use them. They don't use alcohol. These children may play different roles in their family. They may be the hero or the model child or the golden child. They try to bring pride to the family, and they think, of course, that if they can bring pride to the family, that people will stop. They'll stop using drinking or using drugs. The problem child. This is one that is very, very common in families that have alcohol or drug abuse in the family. This individual demands attention and is the most likely to, of course, use psychoactive substances. They become a black sheep in a black sheep family. The lost child, this individual is shy and sidesteps problems by avoiding family and social activities. These individuals are very rarely with the family. Normally, they're hiding in their room someplace, reading or playing video games or doing something other than what the family's doing. The other is a mascot or the family clown. These individuals try to ease tension in a dysfunctional family by being funny or being cute. They have a hard time growing. These individuals have a hard time growing up because they are always the cute one or they're always the family clown. So they become comedians and whatnot. And they have a hard time being mature. Many alcoholic beverage companies target their advertising toward college freshmen, as establishing brand loyalty may generate as much as $20,000 to $50,000 revenue over the individual's lifetime. Multiply that times millions, and you've got lots and lots of money coming into the Budweiser beer or Rolling Rock. I can remember when I was in college that we had one fraternity where all they drank was Rolling Rock beer. Rolling Rock beer comes out of Pennsylvania. Why in the world they thought it was necessary for them to buy case after case after case of Rolling Rock beer, I don't know. But I was at a reunion in 2016, and by golly, that whole table full of people were still drinking Rolling Rock beer, as weird as that sounds. So yes, they did have brand loyalty. 49% of full-time college students binge drink or abuse prescription and legal drugs. This is 2.5 times the amount of abuse found in the general population. The statistics on college students has varying degrees of positive and negative. Daily smoking dropped from 15% in 1993 to 12% in 2005. So smoking became less of a problem, mainly because it is such a destructive substance. And college students tend to be not that smart, but pretty smart. Fraternity and sorority members are more likely to drink than non-members, 88% versus 67%. To binge drink, 64% versus 37%. Driving drunk, 33% versus 21%. Use marijuana, 21% versus 16%. And smoke, 26% versus 21%. As I've told you many times, I was not a fraternity member in a school that was 75% fraternity. And I can tell you that I'm not a follower. And for that reason, of course, I was one of the really lower percentages. I never really drank or did anything when I was in college. And it was mainly because I was an independent-minded person. People that are fraternity and sorority members, they tend to be followers, and they follow everybody else in their fraternity. Only 6% of addicted college students seek help. 78% of college students who use illicit drugs have sex, compared to 44% of those who never use drugs, which sounds kind of negative, I guess, but let's not go into that. Psychoactive substances do have a heavy impact on our college campuses. 1,717 deaths in 2007 from alcohol-related injuries. At my own alma mater, where I did my undergraduate work, they had an alcohol poisoning in one of the fraternities. That fraternity lost their license for 15 years because of that. They have just come back to the campus, and of course they had to pay a huge penalty for doing this. The fraternities, of course, they have hazing for their new pledges, and this was well beyond the pale. Somebody dying because they wanted to join the fraternity. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. 97,000 victims of alcohol-related rape or sexual assault. This figure is way, way, way too high, way higher than it should be. There's really no excuse for people sexually assaulting anyone just because somebody has been drinking. I can remember cases of this happening at my alma mater. Of course, that was back in the 70s, and I thought it was appalling back in the 70s, 60s and 70s, when it was for a far more acceptable process for some young lady to come and get drunk and then to be sexually assaulted. 696 assaults. I know that sounds horrible, but the reality is the Weinsteins and the Epsteins, all of these individuals that have recently been caught doing these things. It was actually more acceptable behavior back in the day, and that's one of the reasons why it didn't bother Trump when he was running for president. That it came out that he had an affair with a Playboy bunny and with a porn star, because back in the old days, this was not a negative thing to happen to you or to happen. 696 assaults by another student who has been binge drinking. In 2002, the federal government legislated to deny college students federal aid if they had a drug conviction on their records. Of the 10,437,000 who applied, 41,000 were denied aid, while an equal number were waived who had completed a drug treatment program. That's 82,000 people who had a drug conviction. Even the non-drinkers are affected by the drinkers. In the study of a campus where over 50% of the campus were binge drinkers, 87% of the non-drinking other students reported being victims of assault, being victims of unwanted sexual advances, having sleep interrupted, having study interrupted, suffering property damage, having to care for a drunken student. There's nothing worse than that. When I was in the service, of course I didn't drink, when I was in the service, but I can remember when I was in the barracks, uh, especially on Friday and Saturday night, if I was working. If I was working that night as an orderly, I would have to take care of drunk GIs. I mean, it was nasty because they would go in, and by golly, they would have their head over the toilet, and doggone it if they didn't raise their head and vomit all over the floor. And of course, you'd have to clean it up. It was just a horrible mess. If the TI or the DI came in and found that the bathrooms were a mess, then everybody would you would lose of your leave. So we couldn't let that happen. Next weekend, everybody would be in the dorm or in the barracks, cleaning all weekend instead of getting to go someplace, and nobody wanted that to happen. Having to clean up after a drunken student, of course, having to care for a drunken student, having impaired quality of life because of the drinking, and of course, that is something that happens. We had an individual when I was in college. If he drank gin, then he became hostile and aggressive. And one night he ripped a stanchion off of the doorway just before you go into the dorm, and he started running it through all the glass windows. All the glass windows had wires through them. So when he did that, they would shatter, but they wouldn't. It wouldn't. The glass wouldn't go anywhere. It just stay there. But it was just, at one point it was clear, and then he'd run this thing into them, and they became completely opaque. Um, and of course, then he vomited all over the place, and people had to clean it up. Not a lot of fun. Drinking and drug experimentation are seen by some as rites of passage for college students. However, one approach to the control of college drinking is a normative approach where the myths of rampant drinking are debunked. For example, 68% of college students thought that their peers thought frequent intoxication was acceptable, while only 14% actually did. Within 18 months, within disseminating normative information, one college campus found that a 16% reduction of drinking to get drunk, a 21% reduction in frequent heavy drinking, 31% reduction in missed classes, 36% reduction in property damage, 40% reduction in unprotected sex. The reality is that some guys think that women find drunk men attractive. This comes from high school, I guess, where the drunk kids were the cool kids. But in college, of course, a lot of kids can drink legally, and the teenage idea that it's sexy or it's attractive, it should be thrown out the window. They're still functioning on their high school mindset. Means of controlling alcohol use: regulate campus drinking. 25% of campuses ban beer. 32% prohibit liquor on campus. 98% prohibit kegs in dorms. The first time I ever drank a beer was on a college campus at a fraternity. And the reason that they were able to serve beer to a 17-year-old was because they were off campus. The fraternity was off campus. Wasn't actually on the campus. Actually, I don't think we had any fraternities on campus. But here they are, they're serving beer to teenagers, and that is, of course, at that time, especially in Indiana, it was illegal. To provide alcohol, tobacco, and drug free dorms, these are known as wellness dorms. Two-thirds of college campuses offer such dorms, of course. Dene College, all your campus dorms are theoretically alcohol, tobacco, and drug-free dorms. Prohibit alcohol at campus events and fraternity sorority parties. Announce and enforce. Of course, that was the whole reason. I mean, what was that stupid movie with John Belushi? I can't think of it. Anyway, that fraternity, of course, everybody was drunk all the time. They were always having parties. But when I was in college, it was the same way. Of course, I didn't drink, so I was kind of a stick in the mud. I still am pretty much a stick in the mud. So You probably don't want to party with me. Announce and enforce campus alcohol drug policies. Work with the local community to make sure that alcohol is not served to minors. When I was in college, we had a bar that was not that far away from campus. A lot of individuals would go over there. They would show their fake ID, and of course, they would start drinking, or they would be able to buy drinks. But they served too many people who had fake IDs, and they got caught and they got shut down. And the owner actually went to jail because he was serving minors alcohol. Strengthen academic requirements, of course. I can remember when I was in college, we started out with 250 freshmen, and the first semester, about 40 of them drank themselves right out of school. So they were playing. They thought they were playing high school. They thought they were still in high school. So most of those guys had to leave. Means of controlling alcohol use on college campuses: schedule more classes on Friday. And of course, most schools have moved away from Friday classes. Keep the library and the recreational facilities open longer, which is a great idea. Prevent alcohol promotions on campus. Notify parents when students run afoul of the drug and alcohol regulations. Provide server training for bartenders at college-sponsored functions. Ban alcoholic beverage advertising in college newspapers. 50% of the campuses ban such advertising. Controlling alcohol use on college campuses. Integrate substance abuse education into the curriculum. Maintain a substance abuse officer to oversee on-campus use and abuse. Join a higher education prevention consortia. 90 such consortia do exist. Create programs at work to work with the neighborhood and community. Initiate early detection, intervention, enforcement, and referral. Studies show that a good drug education program will actually increase the level of experimentation but decrease the abuse. Bad education will actually increase abuse. Studies show that as most college students mature, their alcohol and drug use becomes more sensible. People take psychoactive substances, or now we're not talking about kids anymore. We're going to talk about love, sex, and drugs. People take psychoactive substances either to enhance some aspect of their sexual sensation or not realizing that it will interfere with their sexual sensations. Select psychoactive substances can replace normal sexual emotions, meaning that the emotions will seem to be there when they are not. They may think that that there is intimacy involved, that there's comfort involved, that you really love your children even though you're ignoring them, and it is certainly a release from anxiety. A glass or two of wine to get in the mood. A cigarette after sex. Why would you smoke a cigarette after sex? What does that have to do with anything? Does anybody know? Well, the reality is that one of the things that happens to you when you are sexually excited is that your sexual parts engorge with blood, both males and females. You also have increases in circulation in your face, in your hands, in most parts of your body. So what is a cigarette? A cigarette is a vasoconstrictor. So it brings everything back to normal faster if you have a cigarette after sex. And that's one of the reasons why you see this in cartoons and whatnot. Popper to intensify an erection or an orgasm. Amphetamines to delay ejaculation. Marijuana to enhance the newness of a situation. Ecstasy to increase empathy. Drugs are desirable when the individual feels a physical, social, or emotional deficit. They are aging. They feel like they are not as attractive because they're aging. They're shy. They lack confidence. They have diminished desire, and they're trying to increase their desire level. And they potentially have diminished abilities as well. As you get older, these things happen to you. Unfortunately, the same drugs, when used long term, may create the reverse effect. lack of sexual interest, physical depression, inability to achieve an erection, inability to achieve an orgasm. Drugs may trigger sexual aggression, sexual harassment, rape, child molestation, and high risk sexual behavior. There was a case on Fort Belknap that this man, I had his wife was one of my students, and she was brilliant. She was a really good student. It was really weird. Every time she signed up for classes, he would get her pregnant. As weird as that is, but one night, I guess, he was drinking whiskey, and he molested a 15-year-old boy. Now, theoretically, of course, he wasn't gay. Why did he have sex with the 15-year-old boy? Well, his excuse was that he was drunk. It wasn't his fault. Of course, that's an excuse that you use to yourself. That may be an excuse that your wife accepts. But that's not an excuse that that's not an excuse that the 15-year-old boy's family will accept, and that's exactly what happened. He had to leave, and he went to another reservation. I think he went to his reservation. Uh, Fort Belknap was her reservation, and he was from another reservation. Anyway, he had to leave. Let me get rid of this thing. Sorry about that. Okay. Okay, the three main effects of the psychoactive drugs on sexual behavior are desire, excitation, and orgasm. They do this by releasing hormones, by affecting blood flow, by affecting blood pressure, by affecting nerve sensitivity, by affecting muscle tension. Some examples of psychoactive interference with normal sexual activity. Heroin desensitizes penile and vaginal nerve endings. Desensitizes them, they are not as they're not as sensitive to stimulation. This is really kind of weird. I guess it's not that weird. And I've said this before. You can have a crack whore, but having a heroin whore is not something that happens because it desensitizes your vaginal area to sensitivity. It desensitizes you, so you can't get sexually excited. Alcohol diminishes spinal reflexes, decreasing sensitivity and erectile ability. People think that being drunk makes you sexier. Uh, there is some truth to that as far as females are concerned, but as far as males are concerned, it makes you less likely that you're going to be able to be functional. Steroids increase testosterone, making the user more sexually aggressive. Cocaine and amphetamines release dopamine, which mirrors the release of dopamine during orgasm. Many drugs affect the hypothalamus, which can trigger unwanted hormonal changes. And of course, that's going to make you less likely to become sexually excited. Chronic drug users combine sex and drugs to lower inhibitions, to try to make themselves perform better, to increase their fantasies, to shield themselves from their sexuality if they are gay, I guess. This is back in the day before homosexuality was as acceptable as it is today, to remove themselves from emotional involvement. Alcohol's effect on sexual function are directly related to the blood alcohol levels. Women may use alcohol to lower their inhibitions, to increase sexual pleasure, to raise self-esteem and feelings of inadequacy. However, with the increase of alcohol, there is actually less of a chance of orgasm. Women are more likely to drink to hide sexual dysfunction than men are. Engaging in sex seems to be something to do while they are drunk. For men, enough alcohol can actually prevent them from being able to have an erection, as it diminishes spinal reflexes, decreasing sensitivity and erectile ability. Alcohol also lowers testosterone levels while increasing female hormone estradiol. Chronic male drinkers will have a greatly decreased testosterone and a greatly increased estradiol, creating abnormalities in sex steroid metabolism. What does this mean? It means that they are switching genders. So the sexy drunk in a bar who is an alcoholic is not a sexy drunk in a bar. He's more feminine than he was before he started drinking. Men like alcohol because it anesthetizes the area of the brain that causes fight, flight, and fear, making them more aggressive. However, it does lower your testosterone, making men more likely to act asexual. In one study of heavy drinkers, 60% reported being impotent. 60% reported being impotent. Heavy drinkers. Yeah, it makes you real sexy, but you can't do anything about it. Amphetamines and cocaine have always had a reputation of being sexual enhancers, but this is especially true in the gay community because it increases your confidence, it prolongs your erections, it increases endurance, and it intensifies orgasms. This is especially true of methamphetamine, which lasts longer in the individual system. I'm not going to tell you that, well, maybe I will. My first wife, uh, she left. She left and she ran off, and she ran off and started working at a truck stop. And one of the things, this is back in the 70s, and one of the things that was going on at the truck stop were the truck drivers were wanting to stay awake for an extended length of time. So they were taking speed, and she was pushing speed. Well, she and her supplier got involved one night, and evidently because both of them were on amphetamines, the episode lasted all night long. Um, well, that's all I want to say about that. Anyway, it lasted all night long, and evidently they had sex in many different positions. Now, you wonder why in the world do I know this? It's because she tried to come back, and she told me the whole story. I don't know. It's maybe she thought I would get jealous or whatever, but I just got pissed, and I didn't take her back. Amphetamines and cocaine can greatly intensify the pleasurable feelings that an individual gets from sex. Unfortunately, with continued use in sexual situations, the intensity lessens. As dysfunction begins, the individual will seek to use more and more of the drug to achieve normal sexual functioning. The drug will also intensify pre existing sexual proclivities. If this is something as harmless as sexual inhibition, it will make the individual more confident. If the proclivity is pedophilia or rape, the drug can intensify these behaviors as well. And of course, we have seen this with individuals, not especially, the stories of pedophiles are not that common, but the stories of rape are very, very common. An individual that uses the drugs and then they go out and do what gives them the greatest sexual response, and that, unfortunately, in some cases, is rape and sexual assault. While cocaine may work wonders for men when first used, with prolonged use, the effects may be unintended: delayed ejaculation, decrease in sexual desire, difficulty achieving ejaculation. In women, cocaine may disrupt the menstrual cycle, cause difficulty achieving orgasm, and decrease desire. And of course, here we have cocaine use decreasing the desire in both males and females. So using cocaine over an extended period of time will only cause you sexual dysfunction. Smoking after sex has become a cliche for having had sex. In truth, long term tobacco use is associated with a lower testosterone and erectile dysfunction. In women, it causes reduced fertility. The opioids are depressants and so may act to lower an individual's inhibitions when first used in concert with sex. However, with prolonged use, long-term users report impaired performance and decrease in sexual desire. In one study, the degree of impotence among males was 39%, jumping to 53% when the individuals were actually using the drug. So, opioid, or as I told you before, a heroin whore is not very likely. Of course, this is males. Some of the sedative hypnotics have been touted as sexual enhancers: benzodiazepines, barbiturates, and quaaludes. The reality is that the individual has lowered inhibitions, which makes it more likely that they will be willing to perform sexually. With prolonged use, the individual begins to suffer from sexual dysfunction and apathy towards sexual stimulation, which is not something that you probably are seeking. Select sedative hypnotics have been used as date rape drugs. Rohypnol causes amnesia and lowered inhibitions that makes an individual less likely to resist a sexual assault. GHB lowers inhibition and makes sex more pleasurable. Too much can lead to sleep or even coma. The drug also has amnestic effects. In other words, you can't remember what happened. Another drug that I'm not mentioning here is ketamine. Ketamine can be used as a date rape drug as well because it knocks somebody out and allows you to have sex with that individual, and it also causes amnestic effects. Marijuana's effects have much to do with the attitude of the individual when smoking, much like LSD. You can have a good trip or a bad trip. In a pleasant social situation like a party or on a date, the drug will make people less inhibited and more relaxed, making it more likely that they will do things that they wouldn't normally do. Research looking at marijuana in a controlled setting found that the drug inhibited orgasm but not desire. The biggest problem with chronic marijuana use is that the user does not learn to have sexual relations without being stoned. And of course, then they have to be stoned in order to be able to have sex. MDMA and MDA give their user a warm feeling towards others and induces heightened sensual awareness. However, the heightened sensual awareness does not enhance the ability to have an erection. As well, orgasms are more difficult to achieve. Sexual excitement is unlikely when high on the drugs. If this response is going to occur, it is usually as the person is coming off the drug. Neither PCP or LSD are considered sensual drugs. As an anesthetic, PCP has been used to deaden the pain in select sexual practices in both the gay and the heterosexual communities. What are we talking about here? We're probably talking about anal intercourse, which is sometimes or maybe always painful. LSD is, and as a matter of fact, no psychedelics are known as sexual enhancers. Nitrites are used in both the gay and the straight communities as a vasodilator and a muscle relaxer. Users claim that nitrites prolong and enhance orgasmic sensations if used just prior to the orgasm. Like Viagra and other erectile dysfunction medications, nitrates act as vasodilators, promoting penile erection. Nitrites also relax the anal sphincter muscles, supporting anal intercourse. Psychotropic medications often will interfere with sexual functioning. Tricyclic antidepressants have been linked to decreased desire, problems with erection, and delayed orgasm. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, also cause delayed or inhibited orgasm and impaired erection abilities. Antipsychotics inhibit erectile function and ejaculation as well as desire. With heavy doses of lithium, desire decreases and individuals report having difficulty maintaining erections. Aphrodisiacs actually may not exist, though some drugs will enhance sexual situations. The erectile dysfunction medications Viagra, Cialis, and Levitra allow increased blood flow to the penis, but do nothing for sexual desire. Spanish fly irritates the bladder and the urethra, but does not actually increase desire. Human pheromones increase sexual desire and sexual stimulation, but only select pheromones work on select people. Yohimbine can enhance blood pressure and heart rate, increasing penile blood flow, but it has nothing to do with desire. Drugs are often present in cases of sexual assault. 51% of victims reported using drugs or alcohol before the assault. 44% of the assailants used drugs or alcohol before the assault. Irrational or inappropriate desires may occur after alcohol lowers inhibitions and muddles rational thought. Stimulants make the user feel more confident and aggressive, making it more likely that a date will be assaulted. Sedatives lower inhibitions, making women more susceptible to assault. Marijuana makes users more suggestible to sexual activity. PCP and heroin make users less sensitive to pain, making it more likely that they will damage their partners during sex. And of course, all of these can be a really serious problem. Drug use peaked in the 1980s. We're done talking about sex. Let's stop talking about sex. It's too boring. We don't need to talk about it anymore. Drug use peaked in the 1980s. Positive drug rates at work were 13.6% in 1988. By 2006, with actually more drug testing, the rate had dipped to 3.8%. The lower drug use levels at work may be due as much to drug users avoiding companies that drug test as drug usage at work declining. Estimates are that 8.2% of all workers use illegal drugs. 8.4% of full-time workers are heavy alcohol users. Contrary to the image of the addicts skulking around alleys to support their drug habit, 74.8% of addicts over 18 are employed as full-time or part-time employees. 80% of binge drinkers are employed. 62% of the people diagnosed with substance abuse disorder were employed. Unfortunately, substance abusing employees do not make good employees. They are late 3 to 14 times more often. They are absent 5 to 7 times more often. They make more mistakes than other employees. They tend to have a lower output. They are more likely to appear in a greater number of grievance hearings. They are 3 to 4 times more likely to have an accident on the job. They use 3 times more sick leave. They file for workers' compensation 5 times more frequently. They overutilize health insurance along with their family. They cause premiums to increase for medical insurance. They endanger the health and well-being of coworkers. The most common drug found in employees' samples, marijuana 48.8%, cocaine 16.4%, amphetamines 9.3%, opiates 6.7%, benzodiazepines 5.4%. Now marijuana 48.8%, that's a lot. The problem with marijuana is that it really messes up your short-term memory. So if you're working and you're stoned, then you're probably not doing a very good job because you can't remember from 1 minute to the next what's going on. 26% of people tested for cause tested positive. The area of the country that was the most likely to have positive drug tests was in the rural South. Employee assistance programs are programs established to help employees become better employees by providing treatment and counseling when needed. 45% of all employees in the United States are covered by EAPs. 70% of all employees working for an organization with more than 500 employees are covered by EAPs. EAPs do work. Northrop saw a 43% increase in production from the first 100 employees that they sent to an alcohol treatment program. Employees of the Philadelphia Police Department who went through treatment reduced their sick days by 38% and their injury days by 62%. Providing EAPs for their employees at the Oldsmobile plant in Lansing reduced their lost work hours by 49%, healthcare claims by 29%, sick leaves by 56%, grievances by 78%, disciplinary problems by 63%, and accidents by a whopping 82%. Now the problem with that is that we do not make Oldsmobiles anymore, and that plant is closed, even after they did all those wonderful things. There are several types of EAPs based on financial needs. Internal in-house programs are found in large companies who can afford the expense. Fixed free contracts, the company contracts at set fees for any programs needed. Fee-for-service contracts, the company contracts with an outside EAP on an as-needed basis. Consortia, smaller employers can get together to contract with an outside EAP service. Peer-based programs, peers and coworkers provide the needed service. The military has been at the forefront of drug testing since the war in Vietnam, and that's because we had so many soldiers who were using drugs. In the late 1970s, drug testing in Europe peaked at 1 in 3 soldiers testing positive for illicit drugs. Unfortunately, this was on the cover of Newsweek magazine that 1 in 3 soldiers in Europe tested positive for illicit drugs. That's when I was there. I was doing the testing, and that's really kind of tragic. In 1980, 27.6% of soldiers in the military tested positive for illicit drugs. I was in Germany at that time, and I was doing the drug testing. By 1998, the level of illicit drug use in the military had dropped to 2.7%. And one of the reasons is because the military became an all volunteer force. By 2005, the level had been cut by more than 100% to 1.11%. And of course, that has something to do with all the drug testing that we did back in the 80s and 90s. Not only that, but we were able to start testing for more drugs. And once we did that, soldiers realized that masking it was not going to be as easy as they thought it was, or as they thought it had been before. And we got smarter about collecting our specimens as well. Intense drug testing can be credited for this success, and of course, that is what goes on in the military. The military has maintained a reputation for heavy drinking since its inception. It wasn't until after Vietnam and the drug control movement that the military began concentrating on curbing instead of promoting alcohol use. In 1980, the level of heavy drinking in the military was 20.8%. I think I've told you the story when I first became a NCO. This was back in, when did I become an NCO? 74. Wait a minute. Yeah, 73, 74. I was required to join the NCO club because now I was an NCO. If you joined the NCO club, you had to buy 2 drinks a month. I think it was 2 drinks a month. Yeah, it's 2 drinks a month. So anytime you went into the NCO club, you were required to buy 2 drinks. Now you could drink them yourself or you could give them away. Most people just drank them themselves, and of course that was a really serious problem. One time I got in trouble for they had a commander's call in the NCO club, and of course if you went into the NCO club, you had to buy 2 drinks. So here we had commander's call in the NCO club, and of course everybody had 2 drinks in front of them, and of course I refused to go because I didn't want to be around all that drinking. And I got in trouble because I didn't go to commander's call. So that was back in the '70s. I was at Reese Air Force Base. I left there in '78. Yeah, '79. I left there in '79. So this hadn't taken place yet, and of course all this heavy drinking was taking place. By 1998, the level had been cut to 15.4%. At present, the level has actually increased to 17.1%, higher than the general public at 12%. But of course, military people have a lot to forget, and that's one of the reasons why they drink. The highest rate of alcohol abuse in the military is in the Marine Corps branch. The lowest level of alcohol abuse is in the Air Force, with the other 3 branches of the military, Army, Navy, and Coast Guard, somewhere in the middle. Of course, Coast Guard are now part of Homeland Security, but I can still consider them members of the military. The Air Force was the first branch of the service to crack down on drug and alcohol abuse, and they have been at the forefront of drug and alcohol abuse among the services. The first military EAP was the Air Force's Alcohol and Drug Abuse Prevention and Treatment Program. The Army soon followed with the Army Substance Abuse Program, ASAP, and the Navy's Navy Alcohol and Drug Abuse Prevention Program, NADAP. ADAPT, ASAP, and NADAP. The military programs have been so successful because the military has almost absolute power over all military personnel. They can conduct urinalysis testing whenever or wherever they choose. If a military member refuses to comply to either drug testing or drug rehabilitation, the military can charge them with disobeying a direct order and can discharge them from the service. One of the things that happened before you could leave Vietnam, you had to take a drug test. And if your drug test was positive, they put you in the hospital until your drug test was no longer positive. If you were smoking pot, we couldn't measure pot. I don't know why I'm even mentioning that. But a lot of guys were smoking Thai sticks, which have opium in it. Those individuals, of course, they had to. One of the problems was that the opium was being carried into their fat cells by the marijuana, and it made them opiate positive, drug positive for an extended length of time. If you're ready to go home, I'll tell you what. If you're in country and you're ready to go home, even 2 or 3 day delay is a real pisser. With the influx of reservists and National Guard members into active duty with the hostilities in Afghanistan and Iraq, the Department of Defense instituted the following drug policies: 100% random testing of all active duty personnel, conduct random drug to conduct random drug testing on all military personnel within 72 hours of entering active service. When I was in the service, we that was the first thing we did was collect a drug urine specimen. Separate positive testing to separate positive testing personnel from the military. In other words, zero tolerance. If you test positive for any drugs, they just kicked you right out. Test the mandatory test panel to include new drugs. Maintain 100% mandatory testing for DoD civilian personnel. There is a reason why drug testing has shown a 66% drop in positives from 1988 to 2004. Self-reported positives have increased 30%. Drug users will avoid applying for jobs at businesses that require a drug test. There are ways to beat the drug test, though most of them depend on a non-observant specimen collector. And I can tell you right now, as soon as I got in the service, I was over the age of 21. In order to be a specimen collector, you have to be over the age of 21. So as soon as I got into the lab, that's one of my major jobs was watching guys pee. I never got to watch a young lady pee, but I certainly got to watch my share of young males collecting urine specimens in jars. Reasons for drug test. Reasons for drug testing include pre-employment testing, pre-employment testing, for cause testing, random testing, post-accident testing, periodic testing, rehabilitation testing for criminals on probation, testing for compliance of addicts in treatment, testing by medical examiners to determine cause of death. 12 states allow for testing of welfare recipients. The most widespread testing is in the military, the federal government employees, pre-employment drug testing, in public safety positions such as transportation, drug treatment facilities. When my son used to work in a bar, and people were smoking pot in the bar, and of course there's always secondhand smoke, and he was afraid that he would have a pot. He didn't smoke pot, of course. He's a good kid. So he was afraid he'd get second-hand smoke. So he was very cognizant of making people not smoke marijuana at his club. It was in Los Angeles, and this is a time when people were doing really strange things. There were rap songs out about rolling doobies on the bar, and of course, if they tried to pull any of that stuff, when my son was there, he would spray it with Windex. Evidently, if you spray marijuana with Windex, it doesn't. It ruins it. So he got into more than one fight because he destroyed somebody's marijuana. Drug testing can be conducted on any substance from the body, on your urine, blood, hair, saliva, sweat, or tissue if it's necessary. Of course, when we're talking about tissue testing, we're talking about a cadaver. We're not talking about living beings. I've had to draw urine and blood from individuals. This was in airplane crash situations where the individual had burned. And because of that, you couldn't use hair or saliva or sweat because there was none there. The tissue was disrupted. So what we had to do was we had to draw urine from the bladder and you do that with a needle or blood. And of course, you can't get blood from a dead person unless you stick them in the heart. And of course, that's one of the jobs that I've had. I know, I've complained about mutton with you guys, but one of the reasons that I've been so close to individuals that have burned to death is because there were airplane crashes, and of course, uh, human flesh smells like mutton when it's been burned. At least it does to me. Maybe that has something to do with being mixed with JP4, that's the jet fuel, or maybe the plastic from the seat. I really don't know. But anyway, that's one of the reasons that I am so sensitive to the smell of mutton. Standard drug testing tests for amphetamines, cannabinoids, cocaine, opioids, phencyclidine, and alcohol. Other drugs that can be added to the test: barbiturates, benzodiazepines, methadone, propoxyphene, which is Darvon, and methaqualone. When we were doing drug testing, we could test amphetamines, cocaine, opioids, phencyclidine, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and that's about it. We couldn't test for marijuana. We tried to find a test for marijuana, but unfortunately there were too many false positives. Catnip, strangely enough, would turn the test positive. Oregano would turn it positive. Drugs that are, so if you ate Italian food the night before, you're in trouble. Opioids, poppy seed buns will turn opioids positive. Drugs that are normally not tested for but can be added if suspected: LSD, fentanyl, psilocybin, MDMA or MDA, and the designer drugs. LSD is tough to measure because remember LSD it's a microscopic amount can get you high, and for that reason, it's really hard to detect it in a urine sample. Methods of testing include thin layer chromatography. This method tests for a wide variety of chemicals and is very sensitive to minute amounts of any chemical. The problem is that it can't differentiate between chemicals with similar structures, for example, ephedrine and amphetamines. Thin layer chromatography is what we used when I was in the service. Um, when I graduated from lab school, this was in 71. Yeah, was it? No, it was in 72. 1972. They were really ramping up the drug testing. Two-thirds of the people that I graduated from lab school with went down to Randolph Air Force Base in San Antonio and did drug testing with urine specimens. And of course, I got to hear about how horrible it was to do drug testing with all those urine specimens because they all smelled so bad. Not only that, of course, but the urine was old urine. And of course, you can test urine at any age, unfortunately or fortunately, I guess. But they really complained about it a lot. I was in the top of my class, so I got to select where I wanted to go, and San Antonio was not where I wanted to go. Enzyme multiplied immunoassay techniques, the EMIT program, the EMIT test, radio immunoassay, the RIA, and the enzyme immunoassay, the EIA, are all more modern tests than the thin layer chromatography. The EMIT tests use antibodies to seek out specific drugs. It's very sensitive and rapid, but it cannot determine concentration and produces several false positives. Poppy seeds, as I said before, will look like heroin. Ibuprofen will test as marijuana. Vicks Vapo Inhaler tests as crank. Methods of drug testing: gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, combined in gas liquid chromatography. This system is the most sensitive, accurate, and reliable method of drug testing. It's also the most expensive. The system is so accurate because the technique actually breaks each chemical into fragments and then reads the fragments. This method eliminates false positives and false negatives, but it not only identifies the chemical structure of the drug, but it cross-references it with metabolites that it produces. This test is very expensive and requires highly trained operators, which I have never actually been able to do gas chromatography. Actually, I did do gas chromatography with lithium. We were looking for lithium in an individual suffering from bipolar disorder, and they were taking lithium, and we needed to know whether their level was therapeutic or not. And I did gas chromatography on the lithium specimen. Hair analysis can be done as most chemicals taken into the body are represented in the keratin of the hair follicle. Hair analysis tells the tester what drugs have been used while that specific hair follicle has been alive. Radioimmunoassay tests are run on the hair follicle. Confirmation is done with gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. Drugs can be detected on saliva, sweat, or on the breath. These tests are easier to obtain as they are less invasive, but they also only serve as screening tests and are prone to contamination. The alcohol breathalyzer is a good example of a breath test. Follow-up tests should always be done to confirm any results, and that's one of the reasons why if you have a positive breathalyzer test, they will ask you if you want to if you will allow them to take a blood sample. If you say no, in some states, if you say no, then you are admitting guilt. There are many factors that influence the length of time a drug will remain detectable in a person's system. What is the drug, the absorption rate, the metabolism in your system, the rate of distribution in the body, the excretion rate, the method employed for testing. Detection range of psychoactive drugs. Alcohol will stay in your system for 3 to 5 days. It can be detected within 3 to 5 days. Amphetamines, 2 to 4 days. Methamphetamines, 2 to 4 days. Barbiturates, the short-acting barbiturates, 24 hours. Clonazepam is an intermediate drug. It's 40 to 80 hours. Diazepam will stay in your system. It tends to be a long-acting drug, 7 to 30 days. Crack cocaine will stay in your system for 6 to 8 hours. Meth, this is okay. Meth, 2 to 3 days. I'm not sure what that is. Benzoyl I don't know what that is. Marijuana single use, 1 to 3 days, 4 joints a week, 4 to 7 days. Daily use, 10 to 15 days. Chronic heavy use, 1 to 2 months, 30 to 60 days. Nicotine can be detected within after 12 hours. It dissipates. Opioids, 48 to 56 hours. Buprenorphine conjugates, 5 to 7 days. Codeine, 1 to 2 days. Heroin, 2 to 4 days. Hydromorphone, which is dilaudid, 2 to 4 days. Methadone, 2 to 3 days. Methadone that is used as a maintenance drug, 7 to 9 days. Morphine, 2 to 4 days. Oxycodone, 2 to 4 days. Propoxyphene, which is Darvon, 6 to 48 hours. PCP, if you use it casually, not very often, 2 to 8 days. If you use it chronically, heavy usage, it stays in your system for several months. LSD and its metabolites, 2 to 4 days. Ecstasy, 30 to 48 hours. Drug testing does seem to be reliably accurate, but it is not infallible, of course. False positives can happen when dextromethorphan has been misidentified as an opiate. Some herbal teas have been known to test cocaine positive. Poppy seeds from baked goods have been misidentified as opiates. Errors have also been found after testing personnel mishandled specimens. However, most laboratory errors are false negatives than any other error. Specimens can be manipulated by the testee to create a negative test when the testee is actually positive. Clean urine can be introduced into the specimen by concealed containers, urine injection into the bladder, and catheterization. And we've seen all of these. Not usually in the military. People don't have that kind of money. But somebody like a baseball player or somebody with a lot of money, they can have urine injected into their bladder. Or they can be catheterized and have somebody else's urine put in their bladder. This is not common practice. Certainly not for military personnel. Usually they try to conceal the container and pour that container in. One of the things that we were trained to do was we have to take a specific gravity to make sure that it's not it has enough solid material in it. If you drink a lot of water, then your urine will be almost as clear as water. And of course, that is not a good specimen. We wouldn't accept that. The other thing that we do is we handle the specimen so that we can tell if it's body temperature. If it's not body temperature, then we reject the specimen, and we would make them resubmit a specimen. And they can get into a lot of trouble. We had guys that would run balloons and hoses, and they'd hide it on one side of their penis. And of course, as they're collecting their specimen, they're not really urinating. They're actually opening the hose and just dribbling it in there. Usually, that's not warm enough, and we would reject it. Substances that have been introduced into the urine to mask the drugs present with more than questionable results include aspirin, golden seal tea, niacin, zinc sulfate, bleach, clear, water, ammonia, Drano, hydrogen peroxide, lemon juice, liquid soap, vinegar, and Visine. And these have all been used. I've seen it many times. I always laughed when somebody tried to fool me, and then I made them go collect another specimen. I usually didn't turn them in. They usually turned out positive too, by the way. So I didn't turn them in. If I turned them in, they would have been court-martialed. I let them be court-martialed after their urine came back positive. Well, normally we didn't do that. If it was a first offense, what would happen? They would test them for every day for a week or something, or every day for 3 months or whatever. And that would be the first sergeant's job. Thank God I didn't have to do it. And of course, we'd get whole boxes of somebody's urine from all 2 weeks ago. Of the people over 65, 83% take at least one prescription drug per day. I take 3. 30% take 8 drugs or more a day. 17% of people over 60 in the United States abuse alcohol and illegal drugs. I certainly don't. Unfortunately, our society doesn't pursue elder drug abuse and alcoholism as fervently as they do those problems in younger individuals. Only 37% of elderly alcoholics are identified as compared to 60% of younger abusers. Drugs do not work the same in the system of an elderly individual as they do with someone who is younger. Enzymes in the elderly tend to be less active than in younger people. This tends to make drugs more potent in older people. For example, the loss of liver enzymes means that an individual 70 years old, which is my age, will get the same effect from 10 milligrams of Valium as a 21-year-old taking a 30 milligram dosage. As my mother was aging and she was getting into her 90s, she started having heart problems. Well, that wasn't really her problem. Her problem was that her doctors had never seen anybody as old as she was. There aren't that many 90-year-old women that most doctors take care of. And because of that, they were overdosing her. And of course, this is something that we had to converse with the doctors about. The fact that, and they said, well, this is all experimental. Not only that, but your mother is very active. And we're not used to seeing 90-year-olds, but we're also not used to seeing active 90-year-olds. So anything that we do for her is almost experimental because we're just not used to seeing somebody like she is. And they were GPs, so some of them they didn't want to take care of her. They just couldn't because she didn't fit with their averages, and they like everybody to be the same. The most frequently abused drugs after alcohol for the elderly is hydrocodone, narcotic cough syrup, Darvon, and other opioid analgesics, prescription sedatives such as Klonopin, over-the-counter sedatives, over-the-counter sleeping aids, Prozac, Zoloft, and Buspar. While not everyone takes their medications in the prescribed manner, the elderly tend to have more problems than others. Maybe it's because they can't remember things. Overuse, taking more or many different types of drugs than prescribed. Underuse, failing to take appropriate prescribed drugs or the correct dosage. Erratic use, failure to take drugs in the right dosage at the right time. Contraindicated use, incorrect drug use, being used causing an adverse reaction or drug inactivity, abuse and addiction, using drugs for non-medical purposes despite their negative consequences. Common drugs abused by elders: nicotine, 94% of all 430,000 premature deaths from smoking are people over 50. Tobacco's effects are actually more pronounced in the elderly because of their inability to clear toxins as they did when they were younger. Elderly smokers have twice the mortality risk of cardiovascular disease than non-smoking elders. Caffeine, the average consumption of caffeine for the elderly is 200 milligrams. That's 2 cups of brewed coffee a day. Caffeine toxicity can be seen in doses as low as 100 milligrams. When seniors use excessive caffeine, it can lead to loss of bone density, increasing the possibility of hip fractures. 50% of all hip fractures die within a year of their fracture. The most prevalent problem among elderly is alcohol. 6 to 11% of elderly hospital admittance show signs of alcoholism. ER visits find 14% of the elderly seem to show signs of alcoholism. 20% of the elderly in psychiatric wards are alcoholic. 49% of the elderly in nursing homes are alcoholic. Because of presenting medical problems, alcoholism is often overlooked by medical personnel. They assume that something else is more important than their alcoholism. Alcohol affects the elderly so much more seriously than a younger individual because they have less efficiency of their liver, they have a decrease in body water, their increase in sensitivity to alcohol, the decrease in tolerance to alcohol, a decrease in the metabolism of alcohol in the gastrointestinal tract. Lower amounts of alcohol will lead to intoxication for the elderly, so they're cheap drunks. Over-the-counter medications can cause the elderly problems. Sedatives contain antihistamines for their sedating effect, and the liquid forms have more alcohol than wine. Unisom, Sleepy's, Nitol, and Sominex, all of these have more alcohol than wine does. Cold medications will contain the same combination of alcohol and antihistamines. Abuse of prescription drugs has been reported as low as 5% and as high as 33%. This occurs even in extended care facilities. Benzodiazepines are used by 71% of the elderly between 50 and 65, and 33% of those over 65. These drugs can cause confusion and falls. Benzodiazepines were real popular with people in the 60s and 70s and 80s. These are the individuals who are in their 60s and 70s now. These people that were taking Valium back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. They're still on this stuff, and they're on this stuff for anxiety. They're on this stuff they've been on it for such a long time they can't get off of it. Abuse of prescription opioid analgesics has increased by 500% since 1990. OxyContin, hydrocodone, that's Vicodin, Lortab, or Norco, that's hydrocodone. While few think of the elderly as drug abusers, of the total hospital admissions for the elderly, 20% are directly due to prescription or over-the-counter drug reactions, exclusive of alcohol and illicit drug admissions. 20% of the elderly were regular drinkers and continue to exceed controllable amounts. 50 to 12% of men and 1 to 2, or it should be 5 to 12% of men and 1 to 2% of women. 80% of the senior arrests are for drunkenness. Primary prevention for the elderly. The elderly need to be educated as to the changing effects of alcohol and drugs as they get older and the increased dangers of excessive use. Secondary prevention with this age group involves recognizing the early stages of alcohol and drug addiction and appropriate intervention tactics. Tertiary prevention, treatment for the elderly, involves a slower pace of therapy, focusing on patience and reassurance. And that is the end of the lecture for this week. And we have finished that chapter. So let me turn this thing off. I'll see you guys next week.